Well, good afternoon. This is Mark Skidmore. I'm the director of the NCRCRD, and welcome to today's webinar. Today we have Jason Parker, John Mann, and Scott Loveridge all here at Michigan State University. Jason Parker is a postdoctoral fellow at the NCRCRD. Scott Loveridge is a professor here in agriculture, food, and resource economics at Michigan State University and former director of the NCRCRD. And John Mann is also an assistant professor here at Michigan State University in agricultural, food, and resource economics. And they are going to present some of their work entitled Urban First, USDA R&D Impacts on Regional and Personal Income, where they look at how R&D expenditures flow and have impacts in rural versus urban areas. And so without further ado, I'm going to just go ahead and turn it over to John and Scott and Jason, and they can take it from here.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mark. And thanks for the opportunity to present this webinar. So to kind of do the setup real quick, so just real briefly what we're going to talk about here. So with this paper and the title of the paper, this first part, Urban First, will become clear towards the end of the presentation and why we selected this title. But what we want to do is discuss a little bit of background and about the way we were thinking about our research questions. And then we'll discuss a little bit of the data and the methods, and then get more into the results and policy implications. So then we're going to kind of break out a Q&A session for us there. And then after that, for those that want to stick around, we'll get more into the technical aspects of the modeling and the results that we generated. So some of the factors that were driving this research, at least the primary research question that we wanted to get to, are, you think about what's happening with the USDA R&D budget in relative terms to others. And so we're going to look at a couple of figures that talk about that. And then also the ag industry stakeholder needs and this idea of where ag or USDA R&D has gone, which is in many cases towards technology to basically do more with less. And then there's this other idea that that rural and agriculture are equal to each other, or they mean the same thing. And there's definitely been a trending away from this in reality, but maybe not so much, at least with some of the perception. And so this kind of leads to the idea of what are the impacts of the USDA R&D investments on rural wealth? So before I jump to the next set of slides, I want to go ahead and pop the poll questions out. So we've got two questions I'd like to ask you in the audience. So if Rosa, if you could move those out. The first question basically asks, regarding the focus of USDA R&D investments, how important would you say the topic of rural wealth or rural economies is relative to other topic areas that are covered by USDA? Then the second question asks, how impactful do you think USDA R&D investments are, say, to urban economies? So we'll just take a second for you to answer those, and there may be a little bit of bias because I know several of us are regional economists. Just like another minute for those that want to participate. But with the first question, it looks like we're skewing kind of more towards the important part, and then with the other, it looks like the ideas or the beliefs are split, and so that's one of the things that we'll get to towards the end of this paper. Okay, Rose, you can go ahead and hide these poll questions. Thanks for that, and thanks for your participation. Okay, so let's get to this idea of the research R&D and federal, specifically some of the different federal programs. So when we think about the budget, obviously Department of Defense, which is this area in red, gets a lot of the money. And then Department of Energy, or I'm sorry, National Institute of Health, which was relatively small compared to DoD, but has grown quite a bit. Still not as big as DoD, but it's a pretty important piece. And then, of course, Department of Energy and NASA. We also see NSF funding, which is relatively small. And it's still pretty small, but it's grown quite a bit. And then we get to USDA funding. And so with USDA funding, and in some cases I may be preaching to the choir a little bit, but it's only a very small percent of the total federal R&D budget. And so it's actually less than 2% for the fiscal year 2017. And if we do a little bit of playing with the data, look at it over the course of, say, the last decade, if we control for inflation, some might argue that USDA, it's not just flat, but it may also be declining. And so this has got implications when you think about the kinds of programs that USDA funds. And so for one example, for fiscal year 2017, which was about $2.5 billion, that's what the size of the USDA budget was. One example of some of the programs funded would be, say, the Agriculture, Food, and Research Initiative. And so just the foundational program itself got $150 million, but it's got that program itself has got a pretty big mandate, and so it covers 6 general topic areas. For example, the agriculture economies in rural communities, agriculture systems and technology, animal health and production and animal products, food safety, nutrition and health, bioenergy, natural resources and environment, and plant health, production, and plant products. And a couple of these also have got implications for human health with some of the products that are coming out. Another example of the program is the Small Business Innovation Research Program, which gets roughly 2.5% of the budget. So the point is that there's a little bit of dollars, but they've got a pretty big mandate with what to do with that research spending. So another piece of the question, and the way we were thinking about it, is how the effects or the impacts of USDA R&D have been looked at from kind of a historic perspective. And so not all, but some, and some might argue much, especially more historically, of the USDA R&D investment has been to focus on new technologies to improve the production process and, in essence, do more with less. So when you think about this idea of the total factor productivity, we look at total inputs, which are the green line, and they've basically been flat, and some might argue here roughly around the 80s have actually been declining. However, when we look at total output, the output has been increasing over time, and then the agricultural innovations, which account for this some of this idea of the total factor productivity, and those things can be a broad array of things, but it also has basically filled this gap between the inputs and the output. So one of the ways too we were thinking about this is so these agricultural technologies are developed, and they definitely have this benefit to producers, allowing producers to do more with less. But there have been some other things that we've also seen over the course of the last many decades, and that's the contribution of ag GDP to total GDP. And so this is, on average, has declined in the U.S., but in some states that have been more agricultural dependent, this decline has been a little bit more substantial. So in essence, we come back to this idea of what agricultural innovations have done. So they have allowed producers to do more with less, but they also have potentially allowed people to focus on other things. And we think about this kind of more broadly, and it could account potentially for some of the change from people moving from rural areas to urban areas. So now let's think about this in the context of some of the R&D investments with other agency managed programs. So the other R&D investments, for example, let's say from DoD, Department of Defense, Department of Energy, National Institute of Health, NSF, a lot of those innovations have had technologies that have been developed, and that technology transfer that's come from those programs has had pretty positive impacts on urban areas. And so you can think about the opportunities for new startups, new kinds of industries, Silicon Valley, for example. And so this kind of leads to the way we've been thinking about this, or at least one way we've been thinking about it. And is this technical change? So we've got two things going on. We've got the doing more with less with the agriculture side, with the way where innovations have been focused. And then we've got, in say maybe the urban areas, this opportunity to provide more jobs and such. And so has this led to a potential technical or a quandary, this technical change quandary, resulting in a growing economic challenge that the rural areas are having to face? So when we think about USDA R&D specifically, that's led to ag innovations, different kinds of agricultural innovations, which basically have improved the total factor productivity. And there's definitely a clear benefit to agriculture producers and to some rural economies. At the same time, other agency-managed R&D have led to innovations and led to opportunities for new kinds of firms, new kinds of industries. And these benefits have been very clear to urban areas. But what's less clear is the effect of USDA R&D impacts on, say, urban areas, maybe other agency-managed R&D impacts on rural areas, and then, of course, kind of our primary interest, and that is USDA R&D impacts more broadly on rural wealth. And to be clear, this is kind of how we set up our research, set up our question, and this is how we were thinking about it. So what we wanted to do, we wanted to separate out the R&D impact between rural and urban areas, and separate out two kinds of agency-managed programs, and so USDA versus non-USDA research and development. And so to that, I'm going to hand the mic off to Scott and let him.
Well, I think you hit your mute button before you finished your sentence, but I'll keep going.
Okay, sorry about that.
Thanks, John. It's great. Great setup for the next few slides here. So we developed an econometric model to really look at the questions that John was talking about. We're taking a kind of a somewhat of a long-term view of this using data from the last 20 years at the state level, and it's important to keep that state level piece in mind because a lot of times we can dive down to the county level, but that's not really feasible given the data that we are working with. And we're really looking at two different models, one that looks at the impacts of this investment at the on the urban areas, and the other one on the rural areas, so that the two models are sort of working side by side. And then Jason will talk a little bit at the end about the model specification, where we're using multiple lag order selection, BIC criterion, and rolling subsamples analysis to look at the estimates within the covariance of the data. But he'll get into more of that after we talk about the results. We're going to do this a little different than a typical academic paper where we talk about the model and then the results. We're going to jump right to the bottom line of the model and then come back later and talk about, for those who are interested, more of the technical details of the model. So the data are fairly standard in terms of the basic control variables. Personal income, employment, and interest income from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Again, the separating out urban and rural. We're doing the 50 states plus Washington, D.C. over the sample period that you see there. Maybe a little less traditional types of data are the federal R&D funding. There's this website at NSF that allows you to download that. And because of the lags we're looking at, so we start our R&D data 20 years before the other data, and again it's the 50 states plus DC. And more details about the model are going to be coming, but sort of an overview of how the data have performed over the time period. So this is how USDA research funding has changed over the period, so there is some variability there. Then we have the non-USDA research funding, which also has some variability going on. And there's this spike here upward for that variable, and then downward for personal income, both in the rural and urban areas. And that's the kind of the housing bust crisis of 2008, and then the stimulus there. But they do bounce around, and sometimes rural is growing faster than urban. Sometimes urban is growing faster than rural. So there's good variation in those variables that allow us to look at some changes. So really the basic question is, how does USDA funding impact rural and urban areas differently at the macro scale, at the state level? So we're looking at all the urban counties in a state and then all the rural counties in a state. And here's the bottom line. So here's what the model produces when you do the estimates and then do a predicted present value benefit from a $1 million investment by USDA in a particular state. So what's the marginal impact of that going forward, assuming a 2.5% discount rate? And you see that there are positive impacts everywhere, but the positive impacts are greater in the urban counties of states with the darker red than they are in the rural counties. So, and some of that is driven by discount rate, but basically the urban areas feel the impacts earlier and greater than they do in the rural areas. And we're hypothesizing that the reason for that is basically supply linkages into the research process. So, researcher is going to be buying things with their research dollars that are probably produced in urban areas or distributed out of urban areas, high-tech equipment related to the ag sector. And so that's why you're seeing the distribution the way it is. We did do a sensitivity analysis to see, how the discount rate affected that, and in most states the discount rate that you choose doesn't have really too strong of an impact on it. It might go up a little bit, which is the lighter colored ones, or it might go up a lot if it's a darker colored one. But basically the story doesn't change too much with a different discount rate built into the present value criterion. So basically some of the model results are that the USDA research funding has a long-term positive impact on both urban and rural areas at the 7-year lag period. It also has short-run positive impact on urban areas, in that the funding is not going to decrease the rural-urban divide, but is going to contribute to both types of regions. And so, politically, there are reasons for urban areas to be interested in USDA funding as well as rural, I guess, is the main point that we're finding in terms of what the model says. And folks might be interested to see how this plays out in different states. I know we have at least Oklahoma here. The other folks didn't identify themselves by state, but you can see that in every state except Delaware and DC, which don't have rural areas, or Rhode Island. So the places that don't have rural areas don't have rural impacts, but basically every place that has a rural area also has rural impacts. But pretty consistently across the whole model, the urban impacts are higher. So this is, again, the impact of $1 million investment in the state, somewhere in the state. So, I think it's a good political lesson for the USDA leadership that urban areas ought to be caring about these investments in addition to the rural areas. And we'll stop there for a second and take questions about the implications of the model or anything else, and then Jason will, after we're done with this part, Jason will pick up and talk more about the technical aspects of how the model was built. So the chat box is open, and feel free to enter your questions. Or it could be that Mark has a question too. You can talk, Mark.
Yeah, I see that Dave Scheidler is typing in a question. I'm just, do you have in the data, do you have like, I would guess that a lot of this USDA research funding goes to universities. Is that correct? And if so, a lot of universities tend to be located in urban areas. Is that one of the pathways? And then also, you can answer that question, and then Dave has a question as well.
Yeah, well, clearly USDA research dollars do go to universities, but not exclusively so. There's the whole ARS system, and then there's, as John mentioned too, there's SBIR grants that are distributed all over. But yeah, a lot of it does go to universities, but a lot of the USDA dollars will tend to, not exclusively so, but tend to go to land grants, which often are not in metropolitan areas. So like Iowa State is not in a metropolitan area. Minnesota, that's going to be in a metropolitan area. So it probably depends on which state. I would think that the land grant in Florida, for example, is not particularly metropolitan. So it does vary across the land grants too.
Okay, thank you.
So Dave, so basically the question is, why do you see this higher? Where's Kentucky? Okay, so why do you see the higher impact in Kentucky? That's it's a pretty rural state. But the urban impact is higher, and I frankly think it's probably more of a it's a supply linkage question. So if I'm a researcher and I need to buy a mass spectrometer for my work, so I get a grant and I run out and I buy a mass spectrometer. Well, that mass spectrometer is probably not going to be produced in rural Kentucky. It's probably not even going to be having a distributor in rural Kentucky, and so the purchase of that item is going to probably land mostly in an urban area. Or let's say even if I buy a photocopier, that might run through an urban area. So I think that's what we're seeing here is more the supply linkages dimension of it than the impact on productivity. But I could be wrong. That's my hypothesis. And then Albert says, what's the breakdown on USDA R&D dollar, urban versus rural? And I don't think we have that in our data. Did you look at that, John?
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't really have good flows of which USDA R&D dollars are flowing to urban areas versus rural areas. I think Jason will also touch on that just a little bit.
Yeah, so the NSF site just has it broken down by state.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay.
I think that going back to Dave's question, it's important to, it's probably also important to note that it has to do with the amount of GDP that your baseline is. So the baseline GDP for urban areas in Kentucky is, I believe, significantly higher than rural areas, if you look at the DEA's data.
Well, good questions. I think I'll turn it over to Jason now for the more details on the model.
Great, thank you, Scott. So essentially, the basic modeling setup that we did is to look at total factor productivity. Sorry that the equations are not coming out in quite the right places on the slide, but that's okay. So essentially, we started off with a standard personal income model. So this is a Cobb-Douglas normal economic model for personal income, which we transformed into logs, and then first differenced and computed the total factor productivities by state, by urban and rural sector. So this is the standard way to get to total factor productivity, and it's just a pretty, just following the standard Cobb-Douglas framework. And the total factor productivity is what's left over when you remove the impact of labor and capital on overall personal income. So that's what we were left with, is total factor productivity, and we used that in our model to as the variable we were modeling. So we modeled total factor productivity using both USDA funding and non-USDA funding. So that's the overall setup of the model, was thinking about both of those two types of R&D and their effect on personal income. We included non-USDA funding to make sure that USDA funding wasn't correlated with any other agencies that could cause bias in our results. But USDA funding was the main variable of interest, and we allowed the lag order. So USDA funding was allowed to vary by year. So essentially, you could have USDA funding from this year affecting the data, affecting your personal income, but you could also have USDA funding from 15 years ago, an investment from 15 years ago that's finally paying off today. So we wanted to think about we wanted to allow for multiple timings of USDA impacts. So essentially what we did was to try to select the right lag orders using this Bayesian information criterion. And that's just a standard model selection tool that is fairly easy to compute and allowed us to select the appropriate lag orders by looking at the model's best fit, the best fit portion appearing in the log likelihood, and then the penalty function over here, which depends on the number of lags that you're allowed in your model. So this allowed us to endogenously select the lags, so we didn't have to go through and specify, okay, well, USDA funding has an impact at 5 years and 10 years and 15 years. We allowed it to vary, so we could actually choose the right impacts. So we picked out, so doing all these computations, we did the lag order selection, and I'm just going to breeze through this a little bit because the specifics are not that important, but the specifics are important, but only in a few places. So the best BIC came out for rural areas. The best impact was no lags for non-USDA funding, and 7 lags and a 7-year lag for USDA funding. So essentially for rural areas, they were only affected by USDA funding, and that effect happened after 7 years. So 7-year investment today would impact 7 years from now. And for urban areas, we found that 4 and 6 lags were appropriate for non-USDA funding. And for USDA funding, it impacted at 0 lags, 1 lag, 1-year lag, 5-year lag, and 7-year lags. And that's essentially, so what that's showing together is that for urban areas, they're impacted early by USDA funding at 0, today and next year and 5 years from now, but rural areas are only impacted 7 years out. And that's probably has to do with, like Scott was talking about, the supply linkages. So essentially, an investment today for R&D spending today is going to have a positive impact, is going to have some supply linkages in urban areas today, and it's going to have a positive impact to personal income from the actual uh, creation of a new product or whatever that investment is going for, and that investment is going to pay off probably in about 7 years. So using those models, we were able to look for significant differences, significant coefficients. So to do this, we split our sample into a bunch of different rolling subsamples. And the reason that we did this split is because the econometrics rely on the number of years being a lot less than the number of observations, so the number of states. So the number of years in our data need to be fewer than the number of states. So essentially what we did was 5-year samples, and then we computed the coefficients and their standard errors where we were able to do that in an econometrically sound way, rather than doing that on the entire sample where we would have serious problems. So this was the final result. We don't find much of an impact from non-USDA R&D. That just tends to wash out, and that's probably has to do with the fact that a lot of that stuff is driven by DoD spending and things like that, which are not focused primarily on benefiting personal income. Is not really their main goal. But for USDA funding, we find essentially mostly positive coefficients, and especially in recent years, positive coefficients. And those are significant for both rural and urban areas. So for rural areas, we find that there's a slight positive benefit, and it's significant at the 5% level in 3 of these 6 cases. And for USDA and for the urban personal income, we find various significant positive coefficients at the 7-year lag, and then also some earlier on as well. So there's a positive benefit there, both today and in 7 years from now. And that positive benefit probably comes from the fact that benefits to food production and the various positive benefits from the USDA research are not just affecting rural areas, but they also have a positive impact on urban areas. If prices are cheaper for foods or for anything like that, that's going to have a positive benefit to both areas. So overall, this is there are essentially a lot of spillovers, and we think that probably when funding agencies are trying to decide when the federal government is trying to decide how to allocate funding, a lot of the time they're probably looking more. I'm just going back a few pages. They're probably looking more at rural personal income rather than where the benefit is about the same as the cost, and they're not thinking about all these spillovers that have a positive impact to urban personal income, which are significant.
Jason, would you go back to your summary slide of the impacts with the lags? Keep one more or 2 more. Yeah, that one.
This page.
Yeah, so on it looks like there's a negative coefficient on 2009 to 2014 for non-USD R&D. Is one possible explanation that a lot of this is Department of Defense and not translating into improvements in productivity? Or what negative and significant? I was just wondering what you thought about that.
So essentially, I think that that's probably exactly what I'm thinking, is that a lot of this has to do with Department of Defense, and it has to do with various other agencies whose main goals maybe isn't improving the economic productivity, but instead trying to improve other factors. The NIH is not really, it's a big economic driver, but it's not exactly a funding agent. Their primary goal isn't to boost urban and rural personal income. Their primary goal is to improve, health outcomes. So it's when you have different agencies involved, their goals are not necessarily um, focused around the economic impact.
Yeah, I mean, you could even argue that maybe NIH keeping an older person alive, maybe that would reduce productivity because the person's not, working, right? So we probably, as a society, want the person alive, and we want to defend the country, but it doesn't necessarily translate into higher personal income.
Something else to potentially consider when you look at the allocation of some of the other R&D agencies. So with DoD, it's pretty isolated to a handful of areas, whereas when you look at, and so DoD accounts for, at least half of the R&D budget. When you look at USDA, the allocation occurs differently across states.
Thank you. I just trying to think about the negative coefficient there. Well, are there any other questions or comments from the participants? While we're waiting for that, I'm going to slide over the summary evaluations, and we really appreciate your feedback. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and Scott, John, and Jason, thanks so much for presenting this great research. I really appreciate it. Good stuff.
Great, Mark. Thank you for the opportunity. We appreciate the chance to show this.
Yeah. I don't see any other questions popping up here. So again, if participants can complete the summary evaluations, I think we can go ahead and sign off for today. Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks for hosting.
Yeah, my pleasure.